evening and welcome to the Pompey Politics Podcast.
I'm Ian Tiny Morris.
And I'm Simon Sainsbury.
Good evening, Simon. Well, we've made it. 100 shows.
I know. Happy Halloween.
Happy Halloween indeed. Am I happy about Halloween? I've never been a fan. It all feels a bit invented and American to me, and all overly pumpkin reliant. I'm not sure I approve.
Pumpkin reliant? Is that like a model of a three-wheeled car?
That's a Robin reliant. Okay. Absolutely.
Excellent. Yes, who thought we could get this far?
Well, we've had our highs and lows along the way, and we continue to go strong. And as it is All Hallows Eve, what could be scarier?
Indeed. So I don't know if you've missed it, but I don't know where you've been hiding if you've missed it. But it's COP26, which we want to talk about
in Glasgow.
Yes, and I'm not going to try and do a Glaswegian accent, even though I watched a fair bit of Taggart as a kid.
Yeah, I don't think that would be culturally appropriate. So it's the 26th go at COP.
Mm-hmm.
I'm still not even sure what COP stands for. We probably should research that.
Yeah.
But we didn't.
Yeah. Well, luckily, that's one of the questions that we're going to be asking our guests.
Excellent.
But to set, so should we welcome our guests in and crack straight on with finding out what COP stands for, in not just the acronym, but also what it means?
Yeah, and we'll see what Greta's got to say about things as well, because she's always got something to say, hasn't she? Let's welcome our guests.
And just to clarify, we haven't got Greta on the show.
No.
We borrowed a clip from someone else to demonstrate her thoughts on this subject. Oh, we're summons with the clock. So, good evening, Sue. Good James.
Hello.
Hello.
Congratulations.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, no.
Well done.
What started as an animated discussion between two brother-in-laws on Brexit, which we've referenced before, which was the first episode that we never broadcast. That lives in the darchives. We can't believe that over 2 years on we're still going strong. But thank you for giving up your Halloween evening to discuss COP26 and all things climate change with us. Could I just ask you first of all to introduce yourselves, what your experience and interest is in the subject, the group you represent, and what kind of things they're involved in around Portsmouth? And Sue, can I ask you to introduce yourself first?
Okay. Yes, I've been involved on climate for a while, and I'm currently quite active in both the Hampshire Climate Group and the Havant one. But as of this moment, I'm busy with the COP26 Portsmouth Climate Coalition because we're planning lots of events. Well, two events really. We've got a climate strike on Thursday and a rally and march for the climate on Saturday. So it's a short-lived group, but it's one that was worth mentioning, obviously.
Definitely. And the kind of groups that are coming together in that coalition, Sue, where are they coming from?
Well, Greenpeace, Friends of the Earth. I represent, actually, I forgot to say, Global Justice Portsmouth, and the Havant Climate Groups involved, and Stand Up for Racism, various political parties. It's a really quite a wide coalition because you name it, they're concerned about the climate. Everyone from, lots of environmental groups, political groups, church groups, just ordinary people who aren't involved with the groups are still really anxious to do something at the moment. So.
Marvellous. So thank you, Sue. So James, could you introduce yourself?
Okay, yep. I'm the coordinator of the local Greenpeace Portsmouth group. I've been doing that for almost 6 years. Been volunteering with Greenpeace generally for about 8 years. And we campaign on, essentially our main MO is that we campaign on national issues at a kind of local level, and it can also be international issues as well, obviously of climate change and other things. And that's our main focus, is climate change mitigation. But we also focus on kind of protecting the more, the minutiae of protecting global and local ecosystems as part of that. Like I say, I've worked with Sue before, and we're involved with the COP coalition and helping out with the march as well.
It's marvellous. A very long, proud tradition of Greenpeace. I can't remember. I struggle to hazard a guess how long the organisation's been going, but
50 years this year, actually.
Is it?
Yeah, 50 years. Yeah, 1971 they sailed out to a nuclear testing site.
I remembered it as a small boy, so that's probably dates me as much as anything.
Yeah, Greenpeace was the name of the ship that they sailed out on, so they weren't actually an organisation at that point, obviously, but they called the ship Greenpeace, and then that became their name as a environmental kind of protest group, action group.
Marvellous, thank you, Sue and James. Simon.
Okay, so should we play a little bit of clip that we've borrowed from elsewhere? That will. So this is what Greta had to say at the Youth for Climate meeting, which was on the 28th of September.
The bunny hugging or blah blah blah. Build back better. Blah 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 blah. Green economy. Blah blah blah. Net zero by 2050. Blah blah blah. Blah blah blah. Net zero. Blah blah blah. Climate neutral. Blah blah blah. This is all we hear from our so-called leaders. Words that sound great, but so far has led to no action. Our hopes and dreams drown in their empty words and promises.
So yes, there was Greta in characteristic style calling out the as she sees it, the dearth of action, and some uncomfortable moments for Alok Sharma, watching that and responding to that from the live stream, I guess, from the meeting. So that kind of sets a bit of the background here, and talking about COP26. So I'll put up a graphic in a second to talk about it, what the 4 stated goals are of COP26. But to help us understand it and make sure we're all up to date, and maybe someone can actually tell us what COP stands for, because I'm sure that comes out. So what is COP? Why is it 26? How did it come about? And what sort of people go?
Okay, COP stands for the Conference of the Parties, which is not very helpful, I guess, and it's the United Nations conference. It's set up by the United Nations Framework on Climate Change, and international meetings to deal with climate issues were set up obviously 26 years ago, and they had come, they kind of developed out of the Earth Summit. Want to just read that through, or?
No, that's fine. I'll just put that up for people to see. Don't worry, you carry on. Sorry to disturb you.
Okay. The question about who goes is that it's supposed to be a conference of equals. And if you think about it, most of the big conferences where decisions are made about the world economy are very limited to rich countries, the G20, the G7. The COP26 is open to every single country. So 196 countries should be represented. We have about 125 world leaders coming to it. So who goes? Well, as I say, world leaders, politicians, climate science, negotiating teams from different countries and around the world. So loads of people representing different groups will be there. And the COP26 coalition that I mentioned is going to be around in force. The ones who won't be coming, and there's some high-profile absentees like Putin and President Xi of China, which is a shame, but they're sending delegations, so those countries are represented. What worries us more is that some of the poorest countries won't be represented, and that's something that's concerning the COP26 coalition a lot, because some of them weren't able to get visas, which is ridiculous. Some of them were prevented by COVID regulations, and some of them have been prevented because there isn't enough accommodation. So countries like Haiti, which, as you know, have been hit by hurricanes and earthquakes and all sorts of natural disasters, are not going to be represented at COP26. So I think that's a real failing from the beginning. And it's one of the reasons why, as campaigners, we need to make the voices of those smaller nations amplified, really.
Indeed, because wouldn't those sorts of nations be the ones that are actually going to feel the effects much sooner than?
Absolutely, yes. As I say, it's some of the really poorest nations, like the small island nations in the Pacific, have not been able to go. So I think all the rich countries will be well represented, even if the leaders are not there, but it's the poorer countries that are not represented.
That's a shame. So even if they're not in the room, are their concerns still being addressed either way? Do they still get a chance to have a voice, or is kind of their only chance to make a case by being there, by sending? Because
they are in.
Sorry, go on.
Sorry, they are in groups. Like there's a group of small island states which have been very influential at previous COPs, so they will be represented by that bloc, but their specific concerns might be overlooked.
I see. Thank you. And James, did you have anything to add on that one?
I mean, yeah, exactly that. It's the people that are going to be affected most, who have contributed the least, who are often being shut out of it. And like you say, it's the island groups, which, you know, some of these islands are looking like they could be swept away because of climate change. Yeah, we really need to represent their voices, because you know, they're not being heard. And like Sue said, a lot of it's to do with you know, these poor countries. They don't have the vaccines in place, for example, don't have the ability to come because of COVID, and that is a real failing. And there wasn't an argument that perhaps it shouldn't go ahead at all until they iron out those issues, but obviously it's a very important conference, so it had to go ahead. But another person who's not going to be there is Putin, apparently, and Bolsonaro, and they're leaders of countries that have significant carbon emissions. So it's quite interesting, along with, obviously, it's very disappointing that Xi won't be there from, you know, the Chinese president. So yeah, there are a few issues with this year, but yeah.
Because China are now the world's largest producer of CO2, aren't they? They're the largest emitter of CO2. They overtook the United States in 2018 or something. So
yes, that's right. That's correct. Yeah. It's called Conference of Parties 26 because there's been 26 of them. So 1995 was the first one, COP1, and then here we are. And this one was meant to happen last year, obviously because of COVID, it didn't. So it's been moved to this one.
And I guess that's an interesting segue into the next question, James. Obviously, you know, we heard Greta there, blah, 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 nothing's happened. You know, it's all just empty words and broken promises. So I guess we've had 25 previous rounds, and I think Paris often gets a mention. So in the previous 25 conferences, you know, are there any achievements to point to, and is there perhaps more room for optimism than perhaps Greta's feeling at the moment?
Is that to me? Yeah,
that's to you, James. Yep.
I think what Greta was saying wasn't so much that you know, there's not hope for optimism. I think she's just saying we're fed up there's a lot of talk that comes out of the rich nations that are contributing the most, and not much action. And I think that's what she was saying. She was having a go at the kind of just the endless rhetoric without anything to back it up. And I would say that very little has been accomplished. Yes, of course, COP21 in Paris 2015 was a huge step forward. It wasn't legally binding, unfortunately. And the whole idea of this one is they were told that in 5 years' time, come back with actual plans of how you're going to implement the targets and set in the Paris Agreement. So yeah, I mean, I agree that there hasn't been anything much to shout home about. And actually, kind of there's been since 2015. There's been the most emissions ever, so we're not going in the right direction, and there is hope with this conference, but it's hanging by a thread, the hope, I think, for a lot of people because of previous years, but we'll have to see, obviously.
Do you share that pessimism, Sue, that ultimately 25 previous attempts have not yielded progress?
Well, they haven't yielded no progress. As James said, we had a Kyoto Agreement in '92 when lots of countries did commit to cutting their greenhouse gas emissions, and the Paris Agreement 2016 was actually very important because there were sort of universal commitment, really, apart from Trump, to cutting emissions seriously. But they also built into the Paris Agreement, a kind of ratchet mechanism, which meant that countries had to up their offers of greenhouse gas promises every year, and that they were going to be reviewed every 5 years. So really, Glasgow is about saying, okay, guys, you agreed this 6 years ago now. What have you actually achieved? How can you make this really happen? And so we're building on that Paris foundation. But as James says, emissions have been rising which is terrifying. So we have a lot to worry about.
Would it be fair to say that emissions have been sort of rising universally across the world, or are some countries doing better than others?
Well, definitely some countries are doing better than others. There are some that are really terrible. Australia, Arabia, and when you look at it per capita, places like Australia in particular is the worst, not China, because obviously they've got so many more people. So
yeah, I think when I looked,
they haven't been taking it seriously at all.
No, I think when I looked this morning in terms of, I think it was on the politics show this morning that whilst China is still, I think, accounts for something like 27% of the CO2 emissions, they still have the USA still has a larger per capita output than they do. So it is a mixed bag. So James, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I was just going to say exactly that point. The US kind of leads the way in per person. It's just so happened that China's got a huge population. That's why they're the highest on emissions. But actually, per person, on average, their emissions are way down compared to some of the westernized countries. So that needs to be taken into account. Really, is that it's the way that people in the global north are living. Rather than, to all blame it on China, essentially. And actually, if China were to cut their emissions, you're talking about 0.2, 0.3% on change on the temperature. 0.2 degrees, sorry, 0.2, 0.3 degrees difference. So they're not the kind of, everyone likes to point to them and say, well, what's the point? They have to sort out. Well, actually, it is a global effort. They are the biggest contributor, but they're not. That's not the whole picture, essentially.
I'll explore that some more later. Simon.
Yeah, thank you. So, so the next question is talking about actually kind of the gap that kind of exists between the 2050 net zero target and and you know what's happening. And I think you know you both said the concerning thing at the moment is actually emissions are increasing rather than decreasing. So we're hearing about all of these targets. But what's really happening is that actually emissions are currently are increasing, which is obviously the wrong direction. So I just wanted to share in the stream. There's a video from the UN environmental UN emissions gap program. I don't know why that was so difficult to say. So I'm just going to share that quick video, and at the I'll post that later on into the live stream, the link to that. But I think it kind of tells that story quite well. So yeah, I mean, to be fair, that's, you know, to me that's quite a horrifying video. It talks about being on course to actually a 2.7%, 2.7 degree increase in temperatures, and even what we're on, that being actually the result of what existing targets are. The countries aren't meeting them. That some are using kind of different ways to exclude different things from their calculations, so not everything is kind of being reported, and the sorts of impacts that's going to have of increasing of severe drastic weather systems, and the concerns that is, and that's in comparison to looking at the 1.5 degree target that you mentioned that was originally kind of talked about. So I guess that kind of leads into our next question was, if net zero by 2050 is kind of the overarching target that countries seem to be reaching for, some a bit more, some a bit earlier, some a bit later. Is that going to be too late? And this is to Sue first, if that's all right. So is that going to be too late? And how long before we're going to start seeing still increasing? How long before we start seeing that effect?
In fact, 2050 most emphatically is too late. We need to act much, much faster than that. And one of the problems with saying 2050 is that you can just push the problem aside and think, that the next government will deal with that. We don't have to worry because it's a long way in the future. So most climate campaigners will be arguing for a much faster target than that. And we're also not very happy about saying, zero by 2050 for two reasons. One is we need to be much more 4.5 target, because that's a real definite target, whereas net zero can cover a great deal of fudging and offsetting and governments pretending that they're going to have wonderful technology in the future that doesn't actually exist. So it's much more important to 1.5 target in front of people's minds. And as for when we'll see a difference, we won't see a difference, I'm afraid, because we can't go back on this 1.2 rise we already have. It's extremely unlikely that we could reverse the rise in temperature that we've already had. It's pretty unlikely that we'll hold it to 1.5. And 1.5 has been chosen not because it's desirable, but because it's probably achievable, but only with a big effort. So the initial push is going to have to be enormous to achieve that.
And what do you think stopping us from getting there quicker? I mean, you said that 2050 is too late. It needs to be much sooner. What's the barrier?
Sorry, let me close that down. There are a whole load of barriers. One is the attitude of individuals who are listening far more to the fossil fuel companies and the meat production companies and the loggers and so on than they are to their people, who may be really distressed and having a terrible time because of climate change. There are governments like our own that are arguing about the cost. There are lots of people in the Tory backbenches, particularly, saying we can't afford to invest in good technology and so on, which is nonsense, because if we do invest in it now, it will save a great deal of money in the future. And Lord Stern was saying that 10 years ago. A third reason is, as I already said, there's a lot of reliance options. Net zero is often a very meaningless term, because organizations say they're going to get to net zero, but it's because they are buying carbon offsets, which are fairly debatable, and they're talking about carbon markets, which again are very controversial and may be seriously to the detriment of poorer nations. And finally, I think that one of the reasons why we may have difficulty at COP26 is the approach of the British government. I think we've upset a lot of countries, especially the poorer ones, this year with the aid cuts, with our failure to keep our promises on climate finance, with a hashed up policy on supplying vaccines, and apparently very little effort at diplomacy to try and win world leaders around to get them on board. Apparently, before the Paris talks, Macron was whizzing around the world talking to as many people as possible and persuading them to take it seriously, and the British ministers just... So that's a few reasons why I'm pessimistic.
There's quite a bit there to so thank you. There's quite a lot there. James, did you have anything more to add on that one than that quite extensive list that Sue's given us?
Well, I mean, all I would say is that the net zero thing came about from the IPCC report, and what they were saying, and this is in the October 2018 summary, they were saying that by 2030 we've got to be down on 2010 levels by 45% or 40%, I think, on global emissions by 2030 to try and hit 1.5, which, like, I agree with Sue, I think a lot of scientists and the general understanding in the community now is that 1.5 probably isn't going to be reachable. But it's about staying in that ballpark. It's not 1.5 or any 1.5 or it's over. It's we need to reduce emissions really quickly. And like Sue's alluded to there, what we need is real policy change. And what's being the new denial is, the new greenwash is that we can just carbon offset. We can just do this offsetting. We can just capture carbon, the mystical carbon capture that's going to happen in the future, and we can just carry on as normal. And as Sue said, one of the things that's stopping is lobbying. And this has been going on for 30 years. And that's why we're really at a really crisis station now, because for 30 years, the fossil fuel industry has been putting all of its energy into blocking climate change action. And that has not stopped. They are still to this day and using corporate media in the same way to promote that they can carry on as usual. And all they have to do is replace the carbon with this offsetting, which is completely debatable, and rely on unproven technology in carbon capture, and they can just carry on till whenever. They can keep digging up fossil fuels, and that's the thing. That's the lie now that they're trying to sell. That it's their lobbying that against action in different countries. What they tend to do as well is they sue people through that thing called the Energy Charter Treaty in Europe and across the world. They sue countries who try to block try to move away to greener solutions, to renewable energy, which is what we need to do. And also there's been a campaign from corporate media that often has some, background ties to that world that have just spread doubt, not reported it correctly. And you've got all these different think tank groups and PR companies, the same PR companies that work with trying to play down the effects of cigarettes and cancer. They're literally the same company, and sometimes the same people that have been trying for the last 30 years, causing enough doubt on climate change that it's left us at this point. And that's still going on. It's still going on. They can't deny the science anymore because we're now past that. But what they can do is say, oh, no, we don't need to change our systems. We can still carry on with growth. We can still, we can free market our way out of this, and carbon capture and offsetting will solve everything. And it's dangerous, and it's a lie, essentially.
Okay, thank you. So Stu just wanted to come in quickly before we move on to the next point, if that's right.
Yeah, I hoped about something extra before James said that, because I wanted to say a bit more about the fact that fossil fuel companies in particular have a terrible history of casting doubt on climate science, undermining climate scientists. And I think apart from what James has just said, their other tack is to try and blame the individual. It's all about you must stop eating meat, and you must not fly, and you must do this, that, and the other, and trying to take the blame away from themselves. And actually, it's government, big corporations who need challenging and who are responsible for the mess that we are in.
Yes, 100%.
So to that end, we talk about governments, and I think we would all welcome the fact that the US has now recommitted to the Paris Climate Accord. And obviously previously Trump was very parochial and basically, said, well, I don't really care about the globe. I'm going to do what's best for the US. So I guess my question is, what are the hopes for, we touched on them earlier in the podcast. We've got China, who's the largest CO2 emitter and is still increasing. You've got Australia, who you've mentioned, Brazil, Russia, how can we get those countries to come on board? Because they are very significant polluters, and at the moment they appear to be taking almost a Trumpian line, which is either it's not a problem or it's somebody else's problem. We're not going to commit. James, love your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, obviously if China, the US and India, but I feel for India in a way, because obviously for years they were an undeveloped nature, mainly because of the historical reasons of our imperialism and such. And now when they've started to get an economy where they're, a developed economy, we're telling them, no, you can't, and obviously if all those countries, if Russia, US, if they had a good net zero policy in place and were following it, it would be half the battle won. There's no denying about that. But that's not the whole story. Europe is also a major polluter, massive polluter. So, it's not just about those guys. And I feel like if we are going to talk to other countries and start putting the pressure on other emitters, we have to get our ducks in a row. We have to sort out ourselves. And then we can have a global pressure to make sure that everyone is doing their bit. But certainly, of course, they are part of the picture. They're the big part of the picture. But we have to do what we have to do in our country and across Europe as well.
But would it not be fair to say, though, James, that the majority of the world's leaders are attending this conference, which for me, we could argue that it's virtue signaling, but for me, the fact that Bolsonaro, President Jiang in China, and Putin have basically said it's not worth my time. Isn't that really signposting that those major polluters don't take this issue seriously, or they're in the Trump camp of, well, I don't care about the planet, I'm going to look after my own?
It is a worry, and China have been known to, they know what's coming. They've been trying to buy up land in Africa to then grow their crops, because they know some of the potential things that could happen if we don't bring it in. So they, it is a worry, but we have to before we can start lecturing at other people, we have to sort out, and also the whole China thing. It's not telling the whole story. A lot of the fossil fuel projects that are happening are funded from London, funded from the City of London and the banks, the huge banks in the City of London and across Europe, and obviously in the US as well. They are responsible for so much emissions through their funding of the projects themselves. So it's not just a story of which countries. It's actually the corporations and the banks as well that need to be curtailed, and that can only be done from the UK, because a lot of these banks are UK based. Like Barclays and others, JP Morgan, stuff like that. We have to curtail them as well. So it's not. So obviously, yes, we need to get China on board, but there's not much that we can do as campaigners from that side of things. We just have to make sure that we're sorting ourselves out, because it's not just about our small emissions in our country. It's about what we're doing abroad, and a lot of the stuff we're doing abroad is adding massively to the problem. So.
Thank you, James. Sue, anything to add there?
I'm trying to think what to add to that. I suppose it's extremely hard to influence countries like Russia, China, Brazil, but I guess we can support the campaigning groups in those countries. Difficult in China, but Australia's got a terrible record, and apparently the campaigners there have really pushed Scott Morrison not only to attend COP26, but to make a few promises. Nothing like good enough, but they're pushing him in the right direction. So I think it's making a plug for campaigning, and especially the international ones like Greenpeace, I suppose, who are working everywhere.
Yeah, that's a really good point, actually. That's one thing, if we do become perfect within our own environments, the best thing we can do is support those that are actively fighting the good fight in those countries. And I think that's a really good point. Yeah.
Perfect.
Okay. Thank you. So this one first to Sue, if that's okay. So the sorts of changes that I guess that we're talking about are quite widespread, quite systemic about how our economy works, how talks about massive changes to our standards of living. Are there historical precedents of countries needing to make those sorts of wholesale changes to their to their manufacturing base, to their standard of living, to their economies? Because we've surely, as a species, faced similar sorts of challenges before. What are the similar precedents to the sort of sea change that needs to take place?
I really struggled with this question because I actually can't think of a good example of a country that has really changed. I mean, okay, obviously there have been revolutions in the past and things have been different, but not to decarbonize your society, take away lots of, power from big corporations and so on. This is pretty unprecedented, I guess.
Quite.
There are some good examples of countries that have even gone to, carbon positive, like Bhutan and Costa Rica, but they're not the rich countries, not the ones with power. So I couldn't really think. I mean, there has been some progress. I mean, over the last years, the growth in renewable energy and the reduced cost of renewable energy is really impressive. So there have been changes in Britain, of course, And also, there's a big change, I think, in people's understanding of climate and the popular demand for action, but they don't add up to a whole change of policy yet.
So it kind of
James can add anything.
Yeah. No, that's all right. I mean, I didn't want to try and put words in your mouth. I mean, I had a thought, but James, did you have something to add on that one? But
I mean, I think Sue makes a good point there. That this is I don't think that humans have ever faced this sort of challenge before. You know, the only thing I can think of is we have to have a sort of World War II style effort. So in World War II, everything changed pretty much. Everything was hands to the pump. You know, it was everything was about that huge event, and that did change manufacturing, standards of living, even before and after. And I think this is the same sort of thing. I mean, the fallout of this, if it goes wrong, is going to be a lot more than, you know, I can't remember what the figure. I think it was 20 million people died in World War II. We're talking about maybe hundreds of millions of people, maybe even billions. So this is a massive event, and I think that needs to be said. And we've never faced anything like this. I think COVID, for example, has shown that, you know, you can, although not on the same scale, there's been massive change to people's lives. You know, we've all had to adapt and stay in, and you know, and the government has, you know, ponied up money to people to stay safe in their homes and stuff like that. So there is precedent for massive changes when there's a huge crisis. It just needs the political will. It just needs the right people in power to make the right decisions and invest. And yeah.
I think that's a interesting comparison, because I mean, some domestic politicians make much hay out of using the World War II comparisons for knuckling down and getting on with things and facing insurmountable odds, etc. And maybe we do need to go to war against climate change and face it in a similar sort of way. Is that because it kind of seems that when you look at what happened to to manufacturing, to the way people were living their lives, to the interruptions to freedoms, to the interruptions to a market economy that took place in the UK and indeed in the US in the Second World War, they weren't universally accepted. They were actually quite resisted. Certainly in the US quite heavily, and they were quite heavily lobbied against in the UK by certain parties. So it might be a cheap comparison, but from a perspective of, if that's the level of commitment we need to have to it, then maybe that's the sort of language we need to be having. We need to look at it in that sort of way, that it's a foe that we're all facing together, admittedly one that the world has caused for itself, but maybe that's
yeah. I mean, all I'd say is that, from my kind of little I know about human psychology, I know that we all come together when we have a common foe, and although climate change, isn't another country attacking us or another country trying to take over, or whatever it is a way of grouping everyone together, something to defeat. And what we're really defeating is, climate breakdown, a complete change to our civilization like we've never seen. That's not me talking. That's what some of the predictions are coming out of from the scientific community, from IPCC scientists, even on the record and sometimes off the record. So this is like something we've never faced, and I think it probably might help to see. I know it's a bit controversial, but to see it as an enemy that we've got to all band together and defeat, because the effects of it are just the same, really, in terms of what could happen to our lives and our children and our grandchildren's lives.
Okay, thank you.
So if we look at so this week there was a budget announcement from my least favourite Chancellor, Rishi Sunak. What was in the budget that encouraged you or discouraged you from a Green perspective? I'll ask that first to James.
Very little. I was very disappointed personally. Rishi spoke more about cider than he did about the impending doom of the climate emergency. What was theirs? I think it was like £5,000 for heat pumps, covering a tiny percentage of the UK, and most heat pumps are £6,000 up. That's not going to be a massive incentive. We're one of the worst in the Europe for heat pump sales as it is. So it's a very piecemeal, poor effort I felt on the budget. We need huge investment, and it's just bonkers. It's just bonkers the way. It's very typical of this government. They like to wax lyrical about climate change when the mic's on them. Oh, what about climate change, Boris? They, oh yes, they say all the right things, but in any other area, it's like it doesn't exist. It's just mad. It's just mad.
Sue, and any more encouragement?
Yeah,
for yourself,
I was actually shocked by the budget, because I just couldn't believe that a few days before COP26, and after so many conversations about building a better, greener society, I mentioned neither and put money into either. I thought it was unbelievable, as James said, given the situation. James didn't mention the fact that also there was a lot of money, 21 billion for road building. There was to the passenger fuel duty on internal flights. Those are unbelievable policies in the climate context.
Yeah,
I thought it was shocking.
If I can just jump in there, that's Greenpeace have been banging on about the 25 billion, the biggest road building program to exist in the last, I think, 100 years, in the midst of a climate emergency when we're hosting COP. It's just incredible. And like you say, yeah, I completely forgot about the encouraging flying. It's just mad. It's mad.
Yeah, no, I think it would be fair to say that in terms of my eyebrows when the fuel duty, the duty on internal flights came up, I in terms of a policy, I'm not sure I was expecting or anybody else was. That one was a bit of a breath taker. So, in the interest of time, Simon.
Okay, so and this one is first to Sue. That's okay. So, do protests like we've seen recently insulate Britain? Are they helping the cause, or is there a risk that they're disenfranchising the public?
I have very little but admiration for the people who are brave enough to try and stop traffic. And I think that groups like Extinction Rebellion have done a fantastic job in getting climate issues out before the public. And we've already mentioned it seems like a very focused thing, but the fact that we have money for houses that are leaking the whole time, that the government's policy for retrofitting houses was really bad organised and short-lived, is actually pretty disgraceful. And another thing I really feel very strongly about is why the heck are they still building new houses that aren't to high eco standards, that are proof, well insulated. It's just disgraceful that doesn't happen. So hopefully protesters have got those issues debated. I do understand that drivers were very frustrated, but it's going to be a lot more frustrating if we let climate change go ahead.
Okay, James, want to come in?
Yeah, to answer the question, I believe they help ultimately. They push the government, however you don't like it, they push them and put pressure on to make the changes. If the public don't like it or are disenfranchised, can't say a word, by it, then they basically need to go home. They need to Google what happens if we don't drastically reduce our emissions by 2030. And they need to think of their, their children, their nieces, their nephews, their children's children. IB aren't there to be liked, but they are to get people thinking about this issue, and they're a consequence of a media, on the whole, not the entire media, but most of the media that has completely let us down as a society by not adequately reporting on what we are facing. that's been for me the biggest thing about why people are so upset, because they don't get why these people are stopping them going to work. So it's up to concerned citizens, like the very brave people who are risking financial and physical harm in some cases, to raise the alarm. So I know it's not a popular opinion, but yeah, we stand behind them, and you know, yeah,
it's an interesting one. So the protesters on the M25, there was a Facebook post by the News in the week about the blocking of traffic, and I took the time to go through the comments, and there were 278. So it did take me a little while. There were 12 people who were supportive of what they were doing, yeah. and 266 who weren't, and probably about half of those were happily advocating violence against the protesters. So I do wonder whether those if I look back to those Greenpeace days, when people were driving ribs in front of whaling boats, I think everybody could see that the whalers were the bad guys and the Greenpeace were the good guys in a gender inclusive way. I wonder whether those protesters are seen as the good guys, because the court of public opinion seems to take against them.
What site? What comment section was that?
That's the Portsmouth News.
Portsmouth, yeah, but yeah.
Well, I guess that's the people of Portsmouth, isn't it? It kind of
or
closely affiliated there.
I mean, I think a lot of it is a symptom of there is frustration that the public aren't, although the concern has never been highest, and actually it's the number one issue, climate change, but they're still, on the whole, like you're saying from the comment section, the News is the kind of right-leaning paper in a sense. Its owner is a out-and-out Tory. I think everyone who knows that paper knows that. So it's difficult to gauge it exactly from the comment section of the News, but in general, the public haven't connected to it in a way, and I blame the media, because we go to the media for our source of information. So it hasn't been adequately pushed to people. This is a terrible crisis and you need to care about it. So when people do lie in front of the road and inconvenience them, and I appreciate it is inconvenient and annoying, of course they're going to have that reaction. But if they tallied it up against what and obviously they love and care for their children, what their children and their grandchildren may be facing in future, then they wouldn't be upset. They'd be sitting out there with them. But a lot of people don't get it. They don't connect to it in the right way. And I think it's just a symptom of that. And I think it's a way of bringing it to their faces and saying, look, you may be annoyed about this, but you're not weighing it up against the bigger picture, which is that we are facing disaster across the globe if we do not keep emissions within the ballpark of 1.5 under 2 degrees. So, yeah.
That's brilliant. Thank you, James. So, Simon, just to close us out, do we want to just ask that question about what would be the
okay?
What would make a real difference?
Sue. So if money, we've heard obviously that it's not easy, but if money or political will were no object, what one thing would you do to tackle the climate emergency? If you had a magic wand or you had universal power.
Okay. Well, what we're calling for in this COP26 coalition is a just transition, which actually deals with two aims. One is that we decarbonize our economy and build up renewable energy, but at the same time we do that in a way that's just and equitable and does not exploit people who lose their jobs, are retrained and compensated, by climate change around the world, are protected, so we don't exploit people to get the rare metals that are needed for the green revolution. So it's we have to keep justice at the very center of what we're trying to do. So going green, justice in the middle of it. That's my offering.
Okay. Right. Thank you, Sue. James?
Yeah, I mean that was brilliantly answered. We need to change the laws. Essentially, a just transition away from fossil fuel to renewable energy is the answer. Immediately stop all new fossil fuel projects. I think the Friends of the Earth found out a few days ago that there's 40 projects in line, 16 that are set to be approved by the government. Ban the banks from funding fossil fuel projects. Stop subsidising through tax breaks to the tune of billions of the fossil fuel industry. Stop allowing investment in pension investments, and just put a massive investment into getting the renewable energy infrastructure in place. You know, if you have to tax the billionaires and close the loopholes and tax the corporations for the common good, it's worth it to avoid catastrophe, and also to reduce pollution as well by making driving a car less feasible, bringing in a sustainable transport structure again with investment. So I think to be honest, the only way we're going to get that done is a change of government. A government that believes more in a more kind of Keynesian style of economics, where our society and our people come before the interests of big business and profiteers, the business owners and the shareholders of these huge corporations. We have a chance for a healthier new world where we're self-sufficient for our energy because it would come from the sun, the wind, the sea, where we shop and travel locally, where we have less pollution. That I can see that well. We just need to get there, and we need a government that's willing to do that and has those ideas.
Brilliant, James. Thank you very much. Sue, you opened saying that the COP coalition of which James' team is a part has some events planned for this week. If people want to get involved, what can they do?
Should have thought of that. There's a website called Campaign Exchange, and there's all the details about the events on there in an easy to find way. But basically, there's a climate strike on Friday at 12 o'clock in Guildhall Square, and there's a rally and a march again at 12 o'clock on Saturday in Guildhall Square. Lots of speakers, a march up through the centre of Portsmouth, and then more speakers afterwards. So it's easy to remember. Hope to see you there.
Midday, Guildhall Square. So thank you, Sue. Thank you, James. You've been listening to the Pompey Politics Podcast. I've been Ian Tiny Morris.
And our guests have been
James from Greenpeace.
And Sue from all sorts of things. Global Justice Portsmouth.
Thank you both. And I've been Simon Sansbury. Please don't forget, join us next week when we'll be looking at chamber danger as Portsmouth City Council resumes meeting in the council chamber. We'll be looking at what's on the agenda and what's exciting and interesting for Portsmouth. But you've been listening to the Pompey Politics Podcast.